You've been told military power decides wars. The historical record of asymmetric conflict since 1945 says something almost the opposite. You watch a superpower deploy more firepower in a single campaign than a small state's entire GDP. You watch that same superpower withdraw years later, having won nearly every individual battle. You notice the small state is still standing, still governing, while the superpower's domestic politics have quietly turned against the war. The official narrative says these wars were lost to bad strategy, corrupt local allies, or insufficient resolve. Beneath the headlines, a different logic is operating, one that has almost nothing to do with battlefield performance and almost everything to do with what each side is actually fighting for, and for how long it can afford to keep fighting. This is asymmetric conflict theory, and the real axis of these wars is not strength versus weakness. It is asymmetric stakes versus asymmetric capacity to sustain cost over time. Begin with the pattern you've already noticed. The United States in Vietnam. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The United States again in Afghanistan 2 decades later. France in Algeria. In every case, the superpower possessed overwhelming material advantage: air power, armor, logistics, intelligence infrastructure, and lost anyway, not on the battlefield in any conventional sense, but in the calculus of whether continuing was worth it. Here is what historians and strategists call it. Andrew Mack, in his 1975 article, Why Big Nations Lose Small Wars, published in World Politics, identified the structural core of this pattern directly. Asymmetric wars are not won by the side with greater absolute power, but by the side with greater relative interest in the outcome. For the small state, the war is total. It concerns territorial survival, sovereignty, or identity. For the superpower, the war is one priority among many, fought with a finite and politically contestable budget of domestic patience. You watch this asymmetry of stakes long before you watch its consequences. You watch a small state's population accept losses that would collapse a great power's domestic political coalition within a single election cycle. This is the deeper question, the one most coverage never reaches. It is not why the superpower fails militarily. Superpowers rarely fail militarily, in the narrow tactical sense. The deeper question is why military success at the tactical level so consistently fails to translate into strategic victory, again and again, across different wars, different terrains, and different eras of military technology. Here is the structural answer. Henry Kissinger captured the core mechanism precisely in his 1969 Foreign Affairs essay, The Vietnam Negotiations, where he wrote that the guerrilla wins if he does not lose, while the conventional army loses if it does not win. That single asymmetry restructures the entire logic of the conflict. The small state does not need to defeat the superpower's army. It only needs to survive long enough and impose enough cumulative cost that the superpower's own domestic political system concludes the war is no longer worth its price. You see body counts and territorial control reported as the metrics of progress. You see, underneath those numbers, an entirely different metric actually deciding the outcome: how long a democratic public, or even an authoritarian one facing internal pressure, will keep paying for a war that does not touch its own survival. But the more consequential piece is this: the small state typically does not need to win. It needs only to deny the superpower a clean, fast, low-cost victory, because cost and time are the actual currency of these wars, not territory. Historical precedent makes this concrete. Algeria, between 1954 and 1962, fought France in a war the French military won at the tactical and even operational level almost continuously. The Battle of Algiers in 1957, specifically, where French forces under General Jacques Michaud dismantled the FLN's urban network through intelligence operations, and controversially, systematic torture documented extensively in subsequent French parliamentary and historical. France won that battle decisively. France still withdrew from Algeria 5 years later because Alastair Horn's 1977 history, A Savage War of Peace, demonstrates the FLN's actual objective was never to defeat the French army in Algiers. It was to make continued French rule politically unsustainable in Paris, where a war effort consuming hundreds of thousands of conscripts and provoking domestic crises eventually toppled the Fourth Republic itself in 1958. You watch a colonial power win the urban counterinsurgency campaign in textbook fashion. You watch that same power lose the war within years because the campaign was never the actual contest. This is imperial overstretch, operating through a domestic political channel rather than a purely fiscal one, though the two are rarely separable. Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, 1987, frames overstretch primarily in terms of great powers extending military commitments beyond what their economic base can sustain indefinitely. Algeria and the asymmetric wars that followed it extend Kennedy's framework into the domain of political sustainability. A great power's capacity to wage a peripheral war is bounded not only by treasury reserves, but by how long its domestic public will tolerate casualties and expenditure for a conflict that does not threaten the homeland. The refrain that matters here is this: asymmetric war is not a contest of military capability. It is a contest of comparative time horizons. Mack's 1975 analysis made this explicit. The small state is fighting an existential war with no exit option, and therefore an effectively unlimited time horizon, while the superpower is fighting a discretionary war constrained by election cycles, budget cycles, and a domestic public whose attention and tolerance for cost depreciate steadily the longer the conflict continues without decisive resolution. You watch the Tet Offensive in 1968 fail as a battlefield operation, with the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces suffering catastrophic casualties in nearly every engagement. You watch that same tactical failure become, within months, a strategic turning point that shifted American public opinion decisively against the war. After Walter Cronkite's televised assessment in February 1968 told American viewers the war was, at best, a stalemate. This is where the historical record becomes genuinely useful, because Tet demonstrates the mechanism with unusual clarity. The North Vietnamese leadership, and specifically the strategic doctrine associated with General Vo Nguyen Giap, did not need Tet to succeed militarily. Giap's writings, including his 1961 work People's War, People's Army, explicitly framed protracted conflict as the deliberate strategy, trading short-term tactical losses for the cumulative erosion of an adversary's political will to continue. Tet's tactical failure and its strategic success were not in tension. They were the same event, read through two different and equally valid lenses, because the actual battlefield was never solely the jungle and the cities. It was Washington's domestic political tolerance for an open-ended commitment. You see this pattern repeat with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. You see the Soviet 40th Army win nearly every set-piece engagement against the Mujahideen, controlling cities, highways, and major terrain features throughout the occupation. Here is what that pattern actually produced. The Soviet Union still withdrew in 1989, after a war that cost an estimated 15,000 Soviet soldiers' lives and contributed materially to the broader fiscal and political strain that, within 2 years, accompanied the Soviet Union's collapse. Roderick Braithwaite's 2011 History, Afghanistan, documents how the war's domestic cost in the Soviet Union, economic strain, returning veterans, and a war whose purpose became increasingly difficult. American and coalition forces controlled Kabul and major population centers for nearly the entire duration. The Taliban never won a conventional military engagement against a sustained American or NATO presence on anything resembling equal terms. The Taliban also never needed to. Carter Malkasian, a former senior advisor to U.S. military commanders in Afghanistan, argued in his 2021 book The American War in Afghanistan that the Taliban's core strategic asset throughout the conflict was time itself. A willingness, rooted in deep local and religious legitimacy, claims that no foreign occupation could replicate, to outlast an external power whose presence, however materially overwhelming, remained inherently temporary in the eyes of the populace. You watch 20 years of tactical superiority. You watch a withdrawal in August 2021, followed, within days, by the return of the government the entire war had been fought to prevent. Who benefits from this asymmetry structurally? The small state, whose existential stake in the conflict generates a depth of resolve no discretionary foreign commitment can match indefinitely. Who absorbs the risk? The intervening power's own domestic political coalition, which bears the accumulating cost of a war whose benefits remain abstract, while its costs become increasingly concrete with each passing year. Who gains time, specifically? The local actor, whose presence on the contested territory is permanent regardless of the conflict's outcome, against an external actor whose presence is, by definition, temporary and politically revocable. This is the reframe that ties the pattern together. Asymmetric wars are decided less by the balance of military capability than by the balance of what each side stands to lose by quitting versus what each side stands to lose by continuing. The small state quitting means subjugation or extinction of self-governance. The superpower quitting means a political cost, often painful, but ultimately survivable within its own continuity as a state. That asymmetry in the actual stakes, not the asymmetry in tanks or aircraft, is what determines which side's resolve outlasts the others. You won't just watch the next great power intervention in a peripheral conflict as a story about military capability or strategic competence. You'll be watching for the structural question underneath it. Does the intervening power have a genuinely existential stake in this outcome, or a discretionary one? And how long has history shown that distinction can be concealed by early tactical success before the underlying asymmetry reasserts itself? The next time you hear a superpower describe a peripheral conflict as nearly won, you won't just be watching the territorial control map. You'll be watching how long that power's own public has already been paying for a war it did not start out existentially needing to fight. If this reframed how you're reading current events, the next video goes into a dynamic in the South China Sea that almost no mainstream coverage has mapped correctly. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.